Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the DBMI seminar. Today's speaker is Dr. Carri Chan. She's a professor of business in the Decision Risk and Operations Division and the faculty director of the Healthcare and Pharmaceutical Management program at Columbia Business School. Her research is in the area of healthcare operations management. Her primary focus is in data-driven modeling of complex stochastic systems, efficient algorithmic design for queuing systems, dynamic control of stochastic processing systems, and econometric analysis of healthcare systems. Her research combines empirical and stochastic modeling to develop evidence-based approaches to improve patient flow through hospitals. She's worked with clinicians and administrators in numerous hospital systems, including the Northern California Kaiser Permanente, New York Presbyterian, and Montefiore Medical Center. She's the recipient of a 2014 National Science Foundation NSF Faculty Early Career Development Program Award and the 2016 Production Operations Management Society Wickham Skinner Early Career Prize and the 2019 MSOM Young Scholar Prize. She currently serves as a co-department editor for the Healthcare Management Department at Management Science. She received her BS in Electrical Engineering from MIT and MS and PhD in Electrical Engineering from Stanford University. And with that, I'll hand it over to you, Dr. Chan. Excited to hear this talk.
Great, thanks, Rich. It's so great to be here. And thanks to everybody for logging in. I'm going to talk about some of the work that I have been doing with my colleague Jing and my PhD student Yue Hu on prediction-driven surge planning. This is actually work that started when I was on sabbatical at New York Presbyterian in 2019, I guess, and we were talking about trying to do better nurse staffing in the emergency department. As many of you probably know, Rima Perot, I connected with her. She's since transitioned to Hackensack, and so we're actually working on trying to implement a pilot of this algorithm at Hackensack, hopefully in this coming spring. So I'm really thrilled to be able to be here to speak to all of you. I definitely welcome and encourage questions. Feel free to unmute and interrupt me, or if you feel more comfortable raising your hand, the Zoom hand, but interrupting me always works as well. So with that, let me start with a bit of motivation. And I think for this particular audience, probably many of you actually spend more time focused on the predictive aspects within healthcare than I do. But it's a really exciting area to be in. Where my focus has been is really about how do we operationalize decisions that are based on these predictive analytics. The idea being that healthcare is a messy system. There's a lot of uncertainty, and so that's rightfully so why there's so much focus on building predictions. So that the idea being, if we know what to expect, that hopefully we can prepare and provide provide supply to meet that demand when it's necessary. And so for me, my focus is on trying to make those decisions based on the predictive analytics and really trying to understand what are the benefits to that. You can even imagine a situation where you're developing a predictive model and the returns on adding more predictors, getting better data, they're diminishing over time. And so you might want to understand, is it worth it to expend all that additional effort to get that much more predictive power? Because how is it going to actually translate into the decisions that you're basing on it? If it's not going to have any impact on those outcomes, then maybe it's not worth it. And so that's really the idea of the portfolio of work that we try to look at, is that operationalization. So our particular setting that we've been focusing on is in the emergency department. And the mission of an emergency department is to provide timely care in the event of emergency. But as anybody who's ever been to an emergency room knows, that often there are very long delays. And this is not because they're being poorly managed, it's because of the inherent challenges in matching supply and demand in these settings. So this is a survey, it's now a little bit outdated, but I imagine every emergency department similarly claims these issues. that, the majority of time in urban hospitals that the emergency department is at or even over capacity. And then the last 2 years obviously have made this even more challenging. So thinking about that, what are things that we can try to do? It is not cost effective to just staff in massive amounts of nurses and physicians and auxiliary staff in the emergency departments. They're very expensive. And so you don't want to have large amounts of resources that are not going to be utilized. At the same time, we want to make sure that patients, when they really need that timely access, are able to get it. And so what we've been looking at and recognizing is that nursing is often a bottleneck resource, right? So nurses tend to provide a substantial proportion of the management of patients. When the physician comes and kind of gives the care plan, the nurses are the ones that are actually often executing that. And so with that in mind, we decided to focus our initial study on nurse staffing. I just want to emphasize, though, that the setting can easily be extended to other types of staff as well. So what's the primary question that we want to ask? So the first is trying to understand the prediction aspect, right? And we are certainly not the first people to try to predict emergency department demand. This has been something that people have been doing for many, many years, decades, in fact. But as real-time data is becoming more readily available, data that is available from electronic medical record systems, so beyond count values, but actually information about the types of patients that are in the emergency department, can we utilize this information to improve and make better prediction models for emergency department demand? Hopefully the answer is going to be yes. And if so, how do we incorporate these demand information into making better staffing decisions? And by better, I want to think about a number of dimensions. We have costs, as I alluded to, so the cost of staffing. But we also have costs in terms of patient quality, so access to care. Can we reduce waiting times, right? And so this is kind of a two-pronged approach. The primary, in my perspective, contribution is really here on that incorporation into the staffing decision, but we have to make sure that we can do the first part before we can do that. All right, so what is the setting and baseline of how things are currently done, how staffing decisions are made? And so you can think of emergency departments, many of them that face uncertain demand. Many emergency departments, most of them, I would argue, have some sort of surge plan. Surge plans can encompass many different types of strategies, bringing in overtime staff, prioritizing discharges to open up resources for incoming demand, stopping incoming demand, so going on ambulance diversion. All of these are encompassed in surge plans. What we're going to be focusing on today and in this work is that decision to increase staff. So the way that staffing decisions are made, typically weeks or even months in advance, there is an assessment based on historical data. What is the base number of staff required? So this could be, historically, we see an average of 100 patients per shift during this particular day, during this particular month. And so we are going to try to match our nursing staff to meet that demand. So this you could think of as how many FTEs, full-time equivalent staff, should we have? And these are made, decisions are made well in advance. From a financial standpoint, these staff are typically paid at a base rate, they're FTEs. But we're making these decisions so far in advance, we don't actually know what the demand is going to be. Historical data can be helpful, but there's actually quite a bit of uncertainty in emergency department demand. That's why this is such a difficult problem in the first place. Why do we see so much uncertainty? Well, think about it. COVID-19 is unique, but even pre-pandemic times, some of you may remember that 2017 was a particularly bad flu season, right? And there's actually quite a bit of variation in the severity of flu season. So you can imagine 6 months in advance, flu season's coming up, but we don't know if it's going to be a bad flu season or a relatively mild flu season. And that's going to have a big impact on how much staff you're going to need. So what ends up happening is that essentially hours in advance, as we get closer to the shift, demand in the emergency department may increase. There may be a recognition that there are already delays in the emergency department, and so we need to call in additional staff to surge up. By doing this, because it's kind of on a last minute scenario, you have to pay at a higher rate. Typically, this is at 50% higher than the base staffing, but it can vary depending on institution. The benefit is hopefully a couple of hours in advance, we have a much better sense of the type of demand uncertainty, that there's limited demand uncertainty. Is it a bad flu season or is it a good or mild flu season? And so you have this variation in terms of cost by the rate, but the amount of uncertainty. And so what we want to try to understand is, how do you balance these two things? When should you make decisions, and how much of each staff should you have? If you only had base staffing, you're making a lot of decisions based on high uncertainty. And so you have the risk of overstaffing and wasting a lot of money, or severely understaffing and reducing quality of care and access to care for patients. On the other hand, if you just wait for surge staffing, it's going to be incredibly expensive, right? And so how do you balance these two time periods? So just to start off with the prediction approach, the data that we're looking at is we have data from the Columbia Medical Center adult ED over about a year and a half. And I want to just be clear, that especially in contrast to a lot of the literature that exists out there, what we want to predict is shift level demand, because this is the granularity at which staffing decisions are going to be made, right? So if you're thinking, a lot of the literature is on hourly demand, which there's a lot of benefits to that. But you can't add, it's challenging, I should say, to bring in a nurse for 1 hour and tell them to go home and kind of mix and match that way. And so what we're looking at is, again, at that end goal of operationalizing the decision, what is the demand going to be in the current shift? This is probably not too surprising for those of you in the audience. You can see there's dramatic differences between day and night. This is captured both by the mean, it's much higher during the day, but also the amount of variation. So if we think about this base stage model, so this is weeks, months in advance, there's not that much information that's available. We know whether or not we're trying to predict for the day or the night shift. We know what day of the week it is. And so there's a lot of variation by day of week. And so we use kind of off-the-shelf predictive approaches. Linear regression, we use regression trees as well. For this particular audience, I'll note that the more sophisticated models actually were we suffered quite a bit from overfitting, because even though we have a lot of data, again, we're only predicting on the shift level. So we have we have hundreds of thousands of visits, but we're not trying to predict whether or not somebody's going to arrive. We're trying to predict the total number of people arriving in a shift. So that's about 700, a little over 700 observations. If we have 365 days per year, 2 shifts per day. So then at the search stage, we want to enhance with more information. So there's been lots of work using prior shift counts. So you could think of this as, if we're in the heart of the flu season and we're seeing demand starting to increase, this would certainly get captured by these lagged arrival counts. We're also using Google Trend information, how many people are searching for weather, flu, heart attack. We're looking at the weather forecast. And then we're also using that EMR data to see what type of patients have been arriving, what type of their severity scores, certain comorbidities that they have, because you can imagine environmental factors exacerbating these chronic conditions. So for instance, someone with COPD, maybe if there is pollution, high pollution in the air, you're going to see an increase in lots of people with COPD coming to the hospital. If there are political or social events going on that can exacerbate depression symptoms, you may see an increase in patients who are with mental health challenges. And so we also include as potential predictors the number of patients who are recently treated with these characteristics. So I guess for the purpose of brevity, to really focus on the operational side of things, we find actually that there's relatively moderate improvement with real-time information. Now, certainly we don't expect the performance to decline with more information. But using data from Columbia Medical Center, you can see here in terms of the mean squared error and the mean absolute percentage error, that we do get some improvements, but it's actually relatively small. It's not a dramatic improvement with this real-time information, because the temporal patterns of day versus night and day of week are actually very, very strong, right? So that base prediction actually does reasonably well. Using data from Hackensack, this is the New Jersey hospital, we actually get much more dramatic improvements. And this is in part, I believe, because we have data from COVID in this data set. And so that real-time information that showed that massive increase in COVID patients dramatically reduced the error in these predictions. Okay. Just going to pause for a second to see if there's any questions thus far. Just to basically summarize is that we now have taken this real-time information and we find that indeed the predictions at the shift level demand has improved, although it can be moderate. And then the question is, what do we do with these predictions?
I have a question about how are you evaluating this exactly? Like, are you training on some earlier set of data, like some number of years, and then evaluating on like the year after or something? Like,
yeah, so we have about 18 months of data, and then I think from Hackensack we have 2 years, and so we're basically picking random months out to do for the training and then the validation.
Got it. I see.
I also have a quick question. So what do you mean? No problem. Yeah, what do you mean by real-time information? Like the shift, the previous shift, Like, so exactly what information considered as real time?
Yeah, that's a great question. So essentially what we're doing at the base stage, we're trying to predict, let's say, I believe we did it 3 months in advance. And then what we're trying to do is we're looking at basically 3 hours before the start of the shift, what we're predicting the next shift. And so we're looking at the data of what has come in up to 3 hours before the shift that I'm trying to predict. And so it can be that information of what is the weather forecast for the next shift, what is the number of patients that arrived in the current shift when I'm predicting at T+1. That information would be the real-time information.
Great, thank you.
Sure. Other questions?
Sorry if I missed this, but how did you decide on these particular features? What was that process like, or will you be coming to that?
I'm not going to go into the details of the predictions. So we ran a number of different approaches. Honestly, the details elude me right now. My PhD student did most of it. So I think what she ended up doing is, especially with the more sophisticated models, using kind of automated feature selections. Again, because our goal was more to demonstrate a proof of concept, I guess, that the predictive information, the real-time information does help, although with the NYP data moderately. The simulations I'll show you later are actually based on NYP. So even with this moderate improvement, we'll see in terms of the operational decisions, it has a dramatic improvement using this. And so you can imagine that doing kind of more sophisticated approaches could, again, increase it quite a bit, although the returns are diminishing quite a bit. So there's not like that much gap at this point. Other questions? Great. Okay, so now what we want to focus on is how do we incorporate these 2 stages of prediction? So the base stage prediction and the surge prediction into our nurse staffing decision. And so to do this, we're going to develop a queuing model that has demand uncertainty embedded in it. So let me walk through the model, and please stop me at any point if you have questions. So what we have is what's a traditional MMN queuing system. So we have, Poisson arrivals, exponential service times, and we have n servers. We also allow for abandonment with an exponential clock. So if people are waiting for too long to receive service, they may leave without being seen. In the most extreme cases, they would die, but we would hope that in that scenario, there would be a preemption in the queue. And so this is a very standard queuing model that is used to model many different types of service settings, including emergency departments. What we want to add here is that typically the assumption is that this arrival rate, lambda, is known. And we are going to actually assume that it is a random arrival rate. And so we know what the mean arrival rate is, lambda, but we have some random uncertainty around it, that it's mean 0 and it has and is finite as well. So again, you can think of this, and we see from the data that actually the dispersion of the arrivals is much larger than what you would expect from a Poisson process. And so we incorporate this uncertainty to capture that. So at the simplest case, you can imagine R taking on values high, if it's a bad flu season, and like low, it can be a negative number if it is a mild flu season, and you have that variation around the mean. And so in terms of the information that is available as we're making decisions, looking at this model of arrival rates, at the base stage, we assume that the mean arrival rate is known. So this is through the base stage prediction. We know on average that Monday day shifts in January have, whatever, 80 patients per shift. And looking through historical data, we can also try to estimate what the distribution of that random variation is around it. All right. So we can see if there's a lot of variation or a little bit of variation. At the surge stage, sorry, that's a typo. We actually know the realization of R. So we actually know what the true demand is the mean demand is going to be. So this is the true mean demand of that Poisson process. And we will look, so right now I'm assuming I have perfect prediction, right? That I can know exactly what's the average arrival count, but there's still stochastic fluctuation because we have a Poisson process in the arrival process. I will look into later what happens if we have a noisy estimate of the realization of R, which is what you actually would have in practice. We can't predict demand exactly, and we'll look at that in a little bit. But for the purposes of our development, let's assume that we actually know the realization of the arrival rate. So what is the staffing decision that we are trying to solve? We have an optimization problem, and we're balancing different costs. So we have the base staffing cost. So how many nurses do we staff 6 months in advance at their base cost? And then we have at the surge stage, how many staff do we surge? And the cost for surging at the staff is higher. So C2 is greater than C1. And then we also have that access cost for the patients, right? So this is the cost of patients that need to wait, which can be both in terms of them just waiting, but if the patient waits too long and they abandon the queue, there's an additional cost for that as well. Now, if you look at this cost formulation and the decisions that we're making, we have two decisions: base staffing and surge staffing. And the type of information that we have available at each of these periods is different. So at the base staff, we just have the mean demand and the distribution of the that random perturbation. But at the surge stage, we actually know the realization of the arrival rate, right? So if we think of the sources of random variation that we have in our system, there's two. So the first is the demand uncertainty in the random arrival rate. We don't know if it's going to be a good or mild, a mild or severe flu season. And then we have system stochasticity. So because even when we know the expected number of patients who are going to arrive in the demand, because it is a Poisson process, we don't know exactly when they're going to arrive. We don't know exactly how long it's going to take. Those random fluctuations create queues, right? If everybody arrived exactly 30 minutes apart and they took exactly 30 minutes, there would be no wait. But because of random variation, you might have 3 people arrive at the beginning of the hour and nobody arrive for 2 hours later, and then you end up seeing demand. And so that system stochasticity results in a queuing process. So this work is, broadly defined to, I'd say, 3 main literatures. So first is the demand forecasting for emergency departments. And as I noted, there's a long history, even pre-2007, a lot of people have been working on this. I think the primary distinction that we've taken is we're trying to predict at the shift level. And we're incorporating this real-time severity information of arrivals at the ED. There is a large literature in the operations space on how to manage queues with parameter uncertainty. So when you don't know, you only know what the mean arrival rate is, but there is random variability for that mean arrival rate. And our unique contribution is that we actually are looking at this 2 time scale at which we're trying to base our staffing decisions. And then because I work in an operations department, if we think of supply chain management, there's actually a lot of similarities in what's referred to as dual sourcing. So if you have a far away supplier that is cheaper but has longer delays versus a closer supplier that is more expensive but has much shorter lead times, it's a similar trade-off of cheaper, but you have to make decisions when you have a lot of uncertainty versus more expensive when that uncertainty is largely resolved. All right, so any questions so far? All right, so let me formalize what our model of arrival rate uncertainty is going to look at. So recall that once we have a realization of the arrival rate, the arrival process is a Poisson process with that mean arrival rate. What I'm going to do is I'm going to define my arrival rate as the mean arrival rate plus this term lambda to the alpha. So lambda is our mean arrival rate. Alpha is a parameter between 0 and 1, and then a random variable x that is mean 0 and is also finite. So this model is by construction. What it allows us to do is understand how much of the variation in the arrival rate, how does it compare to the mean arrival rate? So here explicitly, alpha captures the order of demand uncertainty, right? So if alpha is very small relative to the mean arrival rate, the variation is going to be small. And if alpha is large, close to 1, it's going to be actually of the similar order of what the mean arrival rate is. The reason that we do this is primarily from an analytic standpoint. We are able to use asymptotic analysis to look at what's the effect as the arrival rate grows. So as you look at larger and larger systems, how does that amount of variation and demand uncertainty impact the quality of the decisions that we're making and our ability to improve those staffing decisions? So in particular, when you look at this, we can see that the demand uncertainty by construction is on the order of lambda to the alpha. It scales with lambda as lambda to the alpha. Within the queuing theory literature, it is well known that the queue process, the variation that we see in waiting times, is on the order of lambda to the 1/2, so square root lambda. And so what this allows us to do is actually, you'll find, and we'll see that 1/2 is a really critical parameter. If that order of demand uncertainty is greater than 1/2, that tells us that demand uncertainty is larger than system stochasticity, the amount of fluctuations. And if alpha is less than 1/2, then that uncertainty in the arrival rate is actually much smaller than the natural stochasticity that we see in the queue process. All right. So let's try to answer the first question. When is surge staffing beneficial? So if I want to answer this question, I need to consider 2 scenarios. One is when I have this 2-stage staffing approach where I can make decisions at the base stage, then at the surge stage, I see the realization in the arrival rate, and then I make the optimal staffing decision there. And I'm going to refer to this as the optimal 2-stage staffing cost. I don't know yet how to make that decision, but you can, this optimization problem will tell us what the optimal cost would be. Then you could think about the scenario where you don't have that surge staffing opportunity. So you have to make the decision at the base stage. You don't have a second opportunity, but you do know that there is demand uncertainty. So you want to make your decision based on the fact that that arrival rate could be random. And we're going to refer to this as the optimal single stage staffing cost. And so we find that we can actually determine how much savings there would be. So let me kind of parse through what this result tells us. Under moderate uncertainty, meaning that the scale of demand uncertainty is less than that of the system of the stochasticity of the queue process, you'll see that the gap between the single stage and the two-stage staffing cost is small. It scales less than square root lambda, right? So essentially disappears as you scale up lambda. When you're right at that critical level where we refer to this as balanced uncertainty, so the uncertainty equals the system stochasticity, we are at, we scale at square root of lambda. So kind of intuitively, the way that you can think of this is you're going to have the stochasticity from the queue length process, no matter what you do. And so you're always going to have that order square root of lambda term. But here, when the uncertainty is on the same order, and so you can do kind of just as well. But if that demand uncertainty is large, so it's larger than the system stochasticity, you see that there's actually a substantial gap, and that the size of this gap scales with lambda and alpha. So the larger the demand uncertainty, the larger the savings there are going to be from surge staffing. And intuitively, this makes sense. If there's a lot of uncertainty in the demand, being able to postpone your decision until that demand uncertainty is resolved, you should get some savings, even if you have to pay more money at that level, right? So this tells us that really, if we want to think about surge staffing, we should focus on this regime. I don't know yet how to do the staffing. I just know that this is, if I'm going to get any savings, alpha greater than 1/2 is where I should be focusing my attention. All right. So it turns out, using the data from Columbia, and I'm not going to go into the details in terms of estimating the alpha, and I'm happy to share the paper for those who are interested. We find that our estimated alpha is indeed greater than 1/2. It's 0.77. For the Hackensack hospital, we also find it's around this, it's similar. I think it was 0.73. We actually used data from an Israeli hospital where we had much more limited real-time information, but we found that their arrival rate uncertainty was actually much smaller, in part because I think with the Mediterranean climate there, that variation in that flu season that we see in the Northeast and weather patterns and pollution patterns are very different. And so there seemed to be less uncertainty there. Interestingly, also the psych ED at Columbia had actually a very low alpha. So it was less, it was 0.3, I believe. And again, I think because some of the seasonal patterns didn't seem, or the seasonal uncertainty rather, didn't seem to affect the mental health patients. All right, so let's try to figure out now, how do we actually do staffing? So let's take these predictions into consideration and try to figure out what is the right staffing decision. And so I'm going to keep coming back to this. We have two sources of randomness. We have the parameter uncertainty, which we know is on the order of lambda to the alpha, and the system stochasticity, which is due to the queuing process and is ordered square root lambda. And so as long as alpha is greater than 1/2, we're going to see some savings. So let's think about first the optimal decision when you only have one shot. So we're only making base staffing decisions. So there's work actually by my colleague, Asaf Zivi, and some of his co-authors that solved this problem. And essentially, I'm not going to go into all the details. You can get a closed form expression. If you only have one opportunity, you're going to staff to meet the expected demand lambda, and then you have a hedging term. So this hedging term is basically balancing between the costs of having too much staff. So if you overstaff, you're paying the cost and there's no demand, versus understaffing, having not enough staff and then actually having a large demand realization. And so depending on the relative costs between staffing and the queuing costs, you can actually get a closed form expression for that exact hedging amount. So we wanted to leverage this insight into what we refer to as the two-stage approach, where we, at the first stage, use a similar hedging approach. We meet the expected demand, and then we hedge for having too much versus too little. But then at the surge stage, we see what the realization is. Because you have more information, when we were taking this bet earlier on, you still might have gotten it wrong, right? You still might have had too few staff. And so we have this opportunity to actually increase up if we see that the demand ends up being a high demand realization. So we take that opportunity to further fine tune our staffing. And so if you look here, and the earlier work showed that the single stage news vendor is asymptotically optimal. Here we have, between this approach that we're considering, the gap is lambda to the alpha between the single stage and the two-stage option. This is pretty good, but we thought that we could do better. And why did we think we could do better? And what we've done here so far is that this approach is really just trying to meet the mean demand, essentially. So whatever the expected demand is, you want to make staffing decisions to meet that demand exactly. But we know there's also stochastic fluctuations. And we know those stochastic fluctuations are on the order of lambda to the 1/2. At the surge stage, because we know what the demand realization is, the only type of uncertainty that's left is that stochastic fluctuations. So we can try to optimize over that as well. So in the queuing literature, there's a vast amount of work that showed, it's referred to as either the Half-and-Witt regime or the QED regime, which is stands for quality and efficiency driven regime, to really optimize over those stochastic fluctuations. It is well known that you should add additional square root hedging for staffing. That kind of captures the fluctuations of the queue process on the order of square root. And whether you add more or you take some away depends again on those relative costs between staffing and queuing costs. All right. So we take an additional hedging at the surge stage. And again, we have closed form expressions for that. And so what we're able to show in doing this is that our approach, our proposed policy, is considered asymptotically optimal, in the sense that as you scale lambda, essentially the gap between what we are proposing and the optimal two-stage policy, which we don't know what it is, but whatever that optimal may be, the gap disappears. And so we're going to be able to achieve strong performance in this particular setting. Any questions on what this policy is doing? Or we're okay? So I mentioned earlier that for the theoretical development of our policy, we assumed that we had perfect predictions of what the mean demand is going to be. But we're never going to have a perfect predictor. And so you also have to think about about the prediction error. So what we've done is we've actually expanded our theoretical analysis to taking the model of random arrival rate and splitting it into two parts. We have a predictable part and an unpredictable part. And so we're going to assume that the predictable part, we get perfect, we know the exact realization of y, but then x is still uncertain. And so, not surprisingly, if you have very little portion that is unpredictable, we're going to see great improvements. All right, so this red curve is the simulated performance of a single stage model. And then these are the proposed policy that we have. The green curve is if I ignore the fact that there may be prediction error. So I assume that my prediction is a perfect prediction, even if there's errors. And then the purple curve is if I account for the type of errors. And so you can see that as the prediction error increases, if you ignore the error, at some point you're going to do worse than ignoring the prediction altogether and just staffing at the base level. But if you account for the error, you'll never do worse than at just staffing at the base level, because at some point you might just ignore that information. Amanda, I see you have a question. So the question, do you always upweight versus downweight, and when would you do one versus the other? So at the base stage, you may hedge up or you may hedge down. It depends on the relative costs of staffing versus queuing. So you would, if your costs of queuing are very, very high relative to the staffing costs, you're going to overstaff because you want to make sure that you have more than enough staff. But if the staffing costs are very high and the queuing costs are relatively moderate, then you actually may go below. At the surge stage, we actually, here you can see there's a positive part here. We only allow we're not allowed to send nurses home if they've already been scheduled for the shift. And so we don't allow that reduction. So again, that means that you have to be very careful, because if you substantially overstaffed in the base stage, you'll be stuck with all of this staff in the surge stage if demand happens to be low. And so it's really about trying to balance these two carefully. I'll be very frank that there's challenges in terms of how do you balance that cost parameter, because it's a very abstract notion. You ask providers, how much does an extra hour of waiting compare to adding one more nurse to your staff for the shift? It's not really clear how to calibrate it. So I'll show you in some of the simulations that we did, was we actually used Pareto plots to say, as you vary these parameters, how does the performance in kind of more tangible outcomes in terms of waiting time left without being seen translate? And so you can use that to calibrate what's the operating point someone might want to be at. Great question. All right, so talking about simulation, so let me get to kind of the simulation results to highlight what might happen. So, I'll be the first to admit the model that we analyzed is a very stylized version of the real world. It does not capture everything. And so what we wanted to do is create a more sophisticated simulation to get a better sense of what is likely to happen in practice. So first, we allow for time varying arrival rates. So we know that there's temporal patterns, not just between night versus day, but during the day shift, there's big differences. So we allow for that variation. I assumed that everything was Markovian, but data demonstrates often that a log normal distribution fits lengths of stay quite well. So we varied the distribution there. Thus far, I've assumed that I have the ability to add and remove servers at a granularity of 1. But in practice, nurses may take care of multiple patients. So you could actually think of one nurse as adding, if they can take care of 4 patients at a time, 4 servers. Right, so we incorporate this patient to nurse ratio. We use temporal trends. We looked at prediction errors. And we also, our analysis assumed that our system was in steady state. But we're looking at variation over a 12-hour shift. And so there may be actually transient effects that exist as well. So using a high fidelity simulation, we created Pareto plots that looked at the average staffing cost per shift in thousands of dollars versus the waiting time or the percentage of patients who leave without being seen. And so this is a comparison between the optimal base stage staffing, so if you don't have that second opportunity, versus using our policy that does the hedging at both the base stage and then at the surge stage, accounting for system stochasticity. And so you can see that it's Pareto dominating in this particular regime. And so you could say, someone could look at this and say, I want to maintain an average waiting time of less than 20 minutes. And then you can look at what the policy would be at that particular operating point. Said in another way, if we wanted to meet various performance targets, you can essentially tune our parameters until you hit that target performance benchmark. And so here are a couple of benchmarks that we looked at, and we're comparing how much cost savings there are relative to the single stage solution. And I want to be, again, I don't know if I mentioned this already, that single stage benchmark that we're comparing to, that is the optimal single stage benchmark, which I would argue is unlikely to be what most hospitals are currently doing. So you can see, depending on what the benchmark is, whether it's trying to meet a waiting time target, a percentage of left without being seen target, or trying to limit the total number of patients that exceed some excessive wait threshold, we can see that there's 1.8 to almost $3 million in savings per year by using this approach. Even with our prediction model that, if you remember back to the beginning, only marginally improves over the base stage. But having that a little bit more information actually can translate to quite a bit of savings. And you can imagine, as more real-time data becomes available, as the data that's being collected from EMR systems becomes more sophisticated, that these savings may actually be able to further improve. So where are we right now? We are working with the Hackensack Meridian Health System to actually implement it in our partner EDs. We first got the data, and so we had to retrain the prediction model, obviously, to the Hackensack data versus the Columbia data, which we have done. And we are now working on extracting information from a report that the nurses submit every shift, and then spitting out a staffing recommendation. And so we'll do a pre and post implementation study to see what the impact will be on doing this. You can imagine the pre-implementation actually, we can just do what they're currently doing. But even for our surge staffing, we actually have to start making the plans 3 months in advance, because we have to we are deciding both at the base staffing level and then the surge staffing level on top of it. And so we're hoping to launch this at some point in the spring. So with that, just to summarize, we found that there certainly is some value for having real-time information. And while if you look just from a prediction standpoint, skeptics might say, oh, there's not that much improvement. And yet, if we take that and operationalize these improvements into making decisions, we found that there are actually potential savings of nearly 3 million for hospitals that are really operating on a razor's edge. Many who are having major financial challenges over the past 2 years, and even pre-pandemic having financial challenges. These savings could be quite impactful. And so I guess what I want you to take away from this is, when we think about the prediction and the uncertainty that exists, first we want to understand what is the extent of that uncertainty. And if it's large, then having that later opportunity, even at a higher cost stack, can be very beneficial if you do the hedging appropriately. So with that, thank you for your attention. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Great. Thanks, Dr. Chen, for the great presentations. I think we have like around 4 minutes for questions. Yeah. Already see Shreya. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, I don't have a question. I was just clapping.
Does anyone have questions?
Amanda has a question. From a policy
Okay.
and organizational standpoint, how receptive have clinicians' leaderships been on these types of predictive models in justifying
Good
staffing?
question. Yeah.
That's an excellent question. So I think it varies. You definitely need to have buy-in from the right people. I would say the prediction for the nursing leadership, just showing the predictions and the power was not impactful, but showing the simulation results that said, here's what the benefits could be, that has been pretty impactful in terms of trying to get the buy-in. I think also because we explicitly account for the errors in these models, I think that also helps in terms of not blindly trusting what the output is, and saying that even with the errors and accounting for the fact that we expect there to be errors, we can make some improvements. Ultimately, we are going to give, and we've given the providers override power. So if we make a recommendation and they disagree with it, by all means, they should staff as they see fit. But I think the benefit also is that even if they don't go exactly to the same number, it might suggest like add some more, or you don't need as much as you think. It directionally will help nudge them in the right direction. That hopefully will be more efficient. George, I see your hand up.
Hey there. Thank you so much. That's very great. So this is an embarrassing question, so just tell me the answer and that's fine. What I can't tell is, are you accounting for like the added extra cost of having it more variable? I know the whole thing is adjusting for the variability, but like if you go too far off, like the ED goes crazy in some way, is that accounted for in the cost equations, or is that not really, like, because you're kind of looking at the average, you're making your decision based on the average cost, which includes this variability. But if you hit the edges of that variability, you could have bad things happen. Is that included in this cost, or is that not included?
It is in linear way in the sense that our cost function is a linear cost
All right,
function
yeah.
on the queuing. But because the queuing dynamics are nonlinear, it takes the nonlinear effect of that like extreme scenario into consideration. But if you said that, you know, waiting times of 2 hours was 100 times worse, then we're not accounting for that.
Okay, exactly. Okay.
Yeah. So it takes into account through the queuing dynamics, but not only through the expectation, not through kind of tail probabilities that we're not looking at that.
I mean, you could account for that by saying how likely it is when you're done with the analysis, you could say how likely is it to hit one of those edges, and say if the probability is less than 1 in 10,000, I'm not going to worry about those costs.
Yeah, so I guess that we did try to some of the outcome metrics that we were looking. Oops, sorry, at here. Here was trying to look at these tail probabilities of waits being too long. And so we can measure it. It's just from our tool package of being able to say, to give theoretical guarantees on a policy that achieves that, we don't know anything about it, which is sometimes okay, but can't say anything.
What they're doing now is not guaranteeing it either, so I think you're still ahead of the game.
That's fair.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. Do you have is there any other questions? Okay, great. I think we're on time. Yeah, thank you, Dr. Jin, for the great talk, and this is very beneficial to hear. It's a very great prediction model, and we are very likely to see how it can, it turns out in the real application. Yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you so much. It was so great. Hopefully we'll be able to connect more in person as campus further opens up. I always like connecting with DBMI, so let's keep in touch.
Yeah,
absolutely. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.